Hey everybody, welcome back to Weosophy. This time I got 3 questions, and I picked these 3 out of the bunch because they reference pre-existing things that I've done, and I just thought that was interesting that I happen to get, 3 this week that do that, so that's what I decided to go with this time. Let's see. Yeah, maybe there's something a little bit self-congratulatory about that, maybe? I don't know. Okay. Uh, in your cracked article, you said there are gamma and alpha stag beetles. Wow. Well, for starters, congrats on reading something that far back and piecing 2 and 2 together. I don't know how you manage that. LinkedIn, maybe? I don't flip it now. Anyway, are they really both males then? Yeah, unfortunately, I have a video that's not on YouTube, but that's on BitChute. That's about like the biological differences between the 2 sexes and the origin of sexes. Man, sorry guys. Really, what defines a male organism is that they produce metabolically cheap, numerous gametes, which is universally sperm, even in trees. In trees that do have different sexes, male trees produce pollen only, which contains sperm cells, which are identical if you look at them to any animal sperm cell. And females, on the other hand, they're what I call genetic investors. They're usually born with, sometimes they produce them, but they're usually born with a finite amount of, and this is universal, metabolically expensive gametes, very few. Usually, like a single act of copulation, a male will produce more gametes than a female organism will have in their whole life, for example. That's a great way of looking at it. They're usually much bigger, well, they're always much bigger, and they're much more metabolically expensive to produce. And then they invest their own resources in creating the embryo, zygote, and fetus via either nutrients that are allocated to producing an egg or via live birth, in which case there's usually a placenta that feeds the embryo all the way up into the point until they're capable of surviving externally. So that's the difference. It's not chromosomal. I have a whole video about that, but unfortunately I don't have it on YouTube. But yeah, it's on BitChute, which everybody ought to go to anyway at this point. But yeah, that's the difference between male and female. So in that instance, because they're both producing lots and lots and lots of metabolically cheap gametes, yeah, the alpha and the gamma, even though they are cosmetically different, they're still both male beetles. Let's see what else we got. I might actually link that article. Let's see. On your podcast, you mentioned sleep temples. What are they? In other words, you want to know more about them. And it's an interesting topic. They're also called dream temples, and they're, as I mentioned in the podcast, they're the earliest instance of hypnosis, like 1500 BC, if I remember right. Started by Imhotep, who was like a chancellor back in the day. According to the Egyptians, he was actually the half-deified, demigod, son of the Ptah or Ptah, what was that guy's name? I think it was Ptah, and he was like a creator deity of Memphis. Yeah, interesting stuff. So, yeah, you have instances like that. People who are high up in like the aristocracy of the ancient world being believed to be the offspring of deities, and he was one of them, and he started the sleep temples. And basically what you would do is you would fast, you would meditate, you would be surrounded by priests who would chant, and they would put you in a hypnotic state. And sometimes you would have visions, and other times they would simply treat you while you were in that state because pain was diminished and they didn't have, what's that called? Not pain relievers, but anesthesia. They didn't have that back then. So it was an extremely useful thing. But additionally, more importantly, they would analyze those dreams and determine what kind of treatment you needed. It's really not that different from modern therapy. It's actually kind of fascinating to think that they had something that I would absolutely call a precursor to psychology at the time. In some ways, I actually, just from what I've gleaned from studying it, I think in many respects it's actually a more respectable and more scientific, and this is way before the scientific method, than like Freudian psychology. And I'm not actively criticizing the Freudian system. I mean, it's evolved a lot since then, and it's less pseudoscientific, but I mean, some of the things that he said were just preposterous, and this was in a more, enlightened era. And this culture, it spread to the Greeks. The Greeks had them. It was in honor of Asclepios, and everybody knows the Asclepius, the snake symbol that's associated with medicine. That was the deity of medicine for the Greeks, and they would do the same thing. They called it incubation, but it was almost identical in terms of treatment. You would enter a trance-like state. You would have visions. They would analyze those visions, and quite often, from what I glean from it, this is my opinion. Maybe I'm giving them a little too much credit, but I think what they were really doing was they were finding out what was wrong with that person on a subconscious level. So in many respects, it was like psychiatric treatment before psychiatric treatment. And in many respects, like I said, I think it was more enlightened than a lot of modern, what we call modern, 20th century and 19th century treatments. So just interesting stuff. Even the Hebrews had it. They called it Kavanah or Kavana. I'm not sure how you pronounce it actually. And the Romans, I just think this is interesting. The Romans had it almost identical to the Greeks, as a lot of cultural things were regarding that entire Mediterranean area. But what's fascinating is there was actually a sleep temple unearthed in Gloucestershire, and you know who helped unearth it? I just think this is amazing. Tolkien. Yeah, like the Lord of the Rings Tolkien. He helped discover a sleep temple in Britain, a Roman sleep temple. How cool is that? So, yeah, interesting stuff. It's fascinating, and yeah, it's worth more study, but this is sort of the Cliff's Notes version that I'm giving, and I'm also trying not to say so much. It's a horrible habit, and fallen into it lately. Anyway, last question. Wrong file. There we go. In your Critessential article, I'm definitely linking that to the channel, you said Shantae was a Metroidvania platformer. What is that? I think I actually might even know who asked that, because somebody asked me that IRL, and maybe that's... Okay, anyway. Well, there's different kinds of video games. Just as there's different genres of movies, there are different mechanical genres of video games. So a video game can be comical, like a comedy. It can be scary, like a horror. But the mechanics can sort of be their own thing. And a platformer is... like when you think of Super Mario Brothers, the chief means of play is jumping over platforms, hence the name, and dealing with enemies. And so really it's more about traversing an environment. And in this case, it's also a side-scroller, so it's a two-dimensional platformer like Mario Brothers. Now, the reason why it's called Metroidvania is because the Metroid and Castlevania games came up with this idea where you couldn't traverse everything at once. It was a little more open world rather than level-based like Super Mario Brothers, but rather, in order to get to a certain area, you needed a certain unlockable that you would acquire at a certain point in the game. So it would create kind of like a linear pathway, choose your own adventure kind of thing, where you have some level of choice on where you go and what you do, but you also have to go through certain things in a certain order in order to reach other points. And that's how Shantae works. So that's really what that means. Metroidvania just means that you can't access all of the map. It comes to you piece by piece as you acquire different power-ups. And on the other hand, because you're traversing the area and dealing with enemies, you know, in a kind of obstacle-based mechanics, it's a platformer. You know, and the other genres, let's see, RPG, that's a role-playing game. Maybe I shouldn't go into all this because it's a little much, but I might as well. An RPG is a role-playing game. That's a game characterized where you can choose like a class and different skills for a different character, sort of self-insert in a lot of cases, and they level up, and as they level up, that skill sort of branches out into what's called a skill tree. And so the way you play can be completely different from the way someone else plays, whereas a platformer, it's identical. If two people play Shantae, they're going in roughly the same order, and they're having the same experience. Whereas with an RPG, somebody could be a totally different class from somebody else, and the way that they play is totally different. So it's kind of interesting the way those two genres, I think, in many respects, sort of like are the antithesis of each other. And then you've got shooters. There's first-person shooters. That should be self-explanatory. They're in first-person perspective. And then there's other shooters. And then there's shoot-'em-ups, where it's you're in many respects, it's kind of like a platformer, except you're firing a gun or some kind of projectile at multiple enemies on screen. And then you've got beat-em-ups, which are just like that, except you're hitting them. And then on the other hand, you've got fighting games where it's 1 versus 1 usually, and they have equal health bars, and you're hitting each other. So that covers most. And then of course there's puzzle games. Those are games where the chief means of play is actually solving things, and in many times you're actually not a character. You're actually just solving the puzzles on screen. And lastly, there's point-and-click adventure games, which are sort of their own little unique thing that's not very popular, but I think they're fun. You know, Sam & Max is a great example. And they work similarly to puzzle games, except you're clicking various elements of a room to determine kind of a solution to a problem, which are often really surreal and not logical or linear. They're real think-outside-the-box kind of puzzles. Let's see, are there any other genres that are worth noting? Oh, of course, survival horror. So in those instances, you're usually sort of a physically weak character, and you're surrounded by or pursued by really, really powerful and frightening enemies. So that's all I can think of right now. But yeah, the genres, the mechanical, what I call mechanical genres, are very different from the narrative genres. Again, just making up names for things at this point that you see with films, because a game can have a narrative genre, and usually does, but then the mechanical genre could be something totally different. So, for example, you could have a very funny point-and-click adventure game, or you could have a really scary one. So you could have a comedy or a horror. So usually a game will have both of those categories. They'll have a narrative genre, and then they'll have a mechanical genre. So I hope that covers that. And yeah, I'll probably link those 3 things in the video. So look out for that. And like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Bye.